What does it mean to be good in the modern world is a really tricky question, because I think, in that place where I said before about place and space and accepted hegemonic beliefs, well, we're in a transitioning or a pioneering society. We're at a point where the fabric that holds people together is no longer based on a shared set of scientific facts.
Welcome to Chasing Good, a Circle Group podcast with the aim to help us better understand the good that's happening in the world today. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome to Chasing Good. Here today with me, we have a very incredible individual under the name of Mr. Paul Baker. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, no worries, Michael.
To give a bit of context behind Paul being here, Paul was actually my history teacher for years 11 and 12 in high school and played a very pivotal role in opening my eyes to what was important for me so far as what's going on in the world, has laid the frameworks or helped me create a blueprint for what is now Circle Group in many ways, and has an incredible brain and incredible perspective on the world, and very much so I thought it was important to bring him in to have a bit of a conversation around good, hopefully identify a little bit more around good throughout history, and then also talk to a little bit around good in education as well. But enough from me. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Michael. Do you want my radio voice or my normal voice?
all of the voices. We'll change pitch throughout the whole conversation.
Excellent.
Yeah,
thank you for your kind words, young man. Yes, I've been teaching for about 35 years, Michael, and mainly history, of course, but I don't know how many other subjects. I've taught at quite a few schools, so at times I've been a drama teacher or a study religion teacher. I've been a pastoral coordinator. I've taught all girls, all boys, co-ed. I've taught city kids. I've taught regional kids. I've taught in this country and I've taught overseas. I've been lucky enough to win a few awards and big knowledge for my teaching. I've got a Queensland College of Teachers Award, a Brisbane Catholic Education Award. I've been awarded for my social justice work by the Queensland Independent Education Union. I regularly present at state and national conferences, history conferences that is. I have articles that are published in journals like educational journals or history journals, etc. I've won awards for some units I've written. And all through that, I managed to be married for 30 years, raised 3 kids. I'm 60 any minute now. But certainly when I teach, I try and do that lesson of history, which is that young historians, my students in my care like you were back in the day, Michael, not that long ago, you're still a young man, that you are an emancipator. If you study the humanities, there's an emancipatory effect from the study of it, because you can see that seemingly immovable objects will be moved. That there is history has an arc that bends towards justice, and using the historical method, you can not just free yourself but others, and you are like a custodian of the Socratic method, the historical method. And I think maybe when you talk about the blueprint and the verve that you may have got from my classroom, it's probably because that is the emancipatory gift of teaching history. It can have that effect. It doesn't work every time. But the young cools who walked in my room was already predisposed to think deeply about life, and therefore you walked into the right room, and I think that's basically why you and I are here today.
Wonderful. Well, let's dive into it then, shall we?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the going back. So,
yeah.
A brilliant introduction, by the way, around talking about the way that history plays that role.
Yeah.
Can we dive into that a little bit deeper to start off with?
Yeah.
And I guess, can you think of any good examples of historians that have been able to make impact through time as a brief, well, I guess philosophy would be the perfect example there, wouldn't it?
You're going to drop the word good a few times, aren't you? I can see.
Possibly, yeah.
I suppose in some way, let's just step back a little bit more and talk about what is history, because the role of the historian in history requires an understanding of what history is. And perhaps some of your listeners might be interested in just a 1-minute indulgence in understanding what history does, how it does it, and what the outcomes are. So for me, one of the better definitions of what is history is that it's a contested space. I think that's a fantastic definition. I like to use it with kids. It's not saying that there isn't fact in history and there aren't facts that we can build reality on, but there are interpretations of those facts, and they're the most interesting space to play in. So you can have a dominant narrative, you can have an alternative narrative, and that just means because sometimes new sources of evidence are found. Sometimes it's someone really clever asking a unique question of an old source in a way that someone hadn't thought about before. So whatever we're about to talk about, and we're talking about historians, there is always this inescapable margin of subjectivity. See, historians can't just hold a mirror up to the past. It's not that simple. Historians always walk that knife edge between the evidence of the past and the interpretation they weave out of it. But good history, Michael, would have that inescapable margin of subjectivity very small. So it's inescapable because historians are humans and they have their own biases, etc. So it's inescapable, that margin of subjectivity. But good history, Michael, with the rigor of the historical method, so that objective analysis, evaluation, synthesis of the available evidence to make a coherent narrative that can stand up to peer review. That's what a good historian would do. So we have, unfortunately, in the world today, people that call themselves historians who just aren't. One of the most infamous would be David Irving, who's one of the Holocaust deniers. So his inescapable margin of subjectivity is not just the margin on the page, it's the whole page, because you can drive a truck through that. You know what I mean? So whatever we discuss about lessons from history, they're going to come from my inescapable margin of subjectivity. That's pretty much unavoidable. But I just wanted to stress, but that doesn't mean there isn't a consensus view, that facts build a view of reality. We can't just cherry pick sources. We're not free to create a past that didn't occur, which is, of course, what every historian does under a totalitarian dictator. It's fantastic. Control the history narrative, you control the people, because you control their view of reality. And we've learnt that from history. So I just thought I'd get that out there.
Wonderful.
To start with.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, yeah.
And we'll touch on political systems as well.
I'm sure we will.
As it's a important piece of the puzzle throughout history as well. But so can we dive back, if possible, with that context? Looking at the last, let's look at modern history, and obviously with the focus, the podcast being Chasing Good. I'd like to talk to the development, or understand a little bit more about the development of what we consider to be good within our democratic system currently.
Yes.
Could you explain the birth of that, perhaps, and then walk us through a little bit of the development over the years?
Yes. That's such a big question.
Yes,
but it's an important question. So, what are the lessons of history in relation to good? And I think in the end, it really depends on your place and space in history. So we will get to where we are now with so-called liberal capitalist democracies, even though in some ways those terms are a little bit exclusive of each other, but we'll get to that later. So, ideology is socially constructed. So ideology, they're big ideas, often ending with an ism. And no matter where you're born, in what stage in history, there is a dominant set of ideological beliefs that create hegemonic beliefs. And they're the beliefs that create the power base that runs that society. And those ideas are often seen as natural, self-evident, inevitable, unquestionable. They're often accepted by the very people that are disenfranchised by those beliefs. That's how all pervasive they can be. So depending where we are in history, the definition of good often belongs to that place and space because of the reality of the social construction of ideology. Now, those hegemonic beliefs will always change. They always have. There's always a challenging idea, and eventually one paradigm will be replaced by another. So the lesson is that what might be good now may not be seen as good later. But there's no doubt that we have to go to the relationship between government and people. So, to go back to the start, which was part of your question, young Michael. So shall we look at the Latin root for government? So
Yeah, okay, you're going.
let's go there.
Yeah,
Why
okay.
not?
Yeah, love
Language
it.
is
Yep.
important.
Yes, absolutely.
Language informs. Mythology, story informs. It all forms a part.
Fantastic.
Because history is really the study of all human activity. So it's the umbrella subject for all subjects. Apologies to the engineers, chemists, whatever else. History's the most important. You know that, don't you, Michael?
Oh, mate, we're sitting here. I'm not talking to an engineer. So
Right. So gubernator is the Latin word and it means helmsman. That's a great word, isn't it? Helmsman, right? So in other words, that which steers the ship in the right direction. So what's the right direction? The common good. There's the word good, and I'm wearing my goodies shirt, so it's all coming together nicely. So that early form of government was really for protection, so it wasn't so much about high ideals. There were fairly basic things that governments had to do for people, and it was that sort of provision of protection from the enemy. So we go to Athenian democracy for our first example of, sovereigns participating, people participating, in the sovereignty of the state. Now, that's good if you're a male and a landowner and not a foreigner and not a slave and not a woman. So we had a few issues, but it was the first inkling of what that thing would be called democracy. And so the Roman Republic as well confirmed that idea that the sovereignty lay in the people. So we jump ahead after the Dark Ages, or the early Middle Ages more correctly, and we get to a time when the organic paradigm is breaking down. So that's the feudalism. That's the ism, the ideology. And that was a God-centered reality. And so God was the glue that held society together. So what did it mean to be good? To be good by God's will, to do what God instructed you to do. And that was easy, because if you were a peasant, you just hoed your field and you did your thing and you died at 35, and because that was your place. And that lord who rides past with all his refinery, with all his teeth intact, smelling nicely, well, he's there by the will of God, and that's just how it is. So kings and queens rule by divine right, and no one questions that. But of course, that paradigm is breaking down. Those hegemonic beliefs are being challenged. And so we start to see like the English Civil War, and we start to see the fracturing of society. And so then people started to question again, in some ways, what is the role of people to government? What is good? So we get the first use of the term social contract, because you'll hear that term today, and it's used a lot in terms of democracy. So the first guy to use that is a guy called Thomas Hobbes. And he wrote this piece called Leviathan. But he's not using it in the way you and I would think, is this one of these first democratic? No, not at all. So he lived at a time of the English Civil War, and things were going pretty bad. And they were chopping off the heads of kings. So Charlie he lost his head. And so Hobbes didn't like what was going on. So he wrote the first use of the term social contract, but it meant that what guarantees people's safety is obedience to an absolute monarch. So the social contract was, if you're on your own, this is Hobbes's view, man in his natural state is poor, solitary, brutish, short. So you need obedience to a higher figure through the will of God. That's the social contract. Now, shortly after that, a guy called John Locke comes along and goes, yeah, you're right about the social contract, but you're wrong about the absolute monarch. Governments only have legitimacy if they rule in the best interests of the people. And there's your goodness coming through. A good government, good people humming along. And then a guy called Rousseau one of the French philosophers. So he adds like that final layer to the social contract theorists. And he says, because what always puzzled the social contract theorists in the early days was, well, if humans make rules, why should other humans follow them? If a citizen's making a rule, why do I as a citizen have to follow that rule? And Rousseau was the one who said, yeah, but you're only bound by them if you participate in the making of them. And that's the relationship, of course, in a modern democracy. And that's the idea that the Americans took in their revolution against the British, that no taxation without representation. In other words, you can't do stuff to me when I don't have any say in how it goes. And these are the ideas and the rethinking that lead to what we have today, modernity. And we have this liberal capitalist democracy. But, Michael, what does it mean to be good? Of course, in the social contract would be that because I participate in government decisions, I'm a good citizen and I follow the laws. But the problem can be that liberalism's a very nice idea because it's a society of equals. And I would like to think I live in a society of equals, and I want you to grow up in a society of equals like I want my kids to as well. The trouble would be, are we really in a society of equals under capitalism? Because capitalism is, of course, about investing in the entrepreneurial class, so we keep them rich, they keep building the factories and making the jobs, and the money all trickles down. It's Adam Smith's invisible hand. The trouble is that modernity has taught us that trickle down often just simply doesn't occur, and that invisible hand is very invisible. Can you have a society of equals where profit is put in front of people? Can you have a society of equals where the environment is less important than the shareholder? It's these type of things that lie at the heart of the dilemma that we're facing. And that is why, in many ways, you and I are in a time similar to, I suppose, the revolutionary era that broke down feudalism that we talked about before. Because we see from the 1960s onwards a lot of the hegemonic beliefs that underpin modernity. And modernity was a thing that replaced a superstitious set of beliefs that really had problems with legitimacy of government, etc.
Can I just get a quick
Yes.
definition of modernity, please?
So, if feudalism was a God-centered reality, and that's kind of the organic paradigm. So a paradigm is made up of those hegemonic beliefs that were natural, inevitable, etc. And they form a view of reality. Thoughts, visions, ideas actually make up a reality. So that reality of the organic paradigm, often called that because it was tied up with fertility of the land, the sowing of the seed, the growing of the seed, agriculture was crucial. So in many ways, we replace God with science and reason, which would create progress. And that's the modern industrial paradigm. That's modernism. That's modernity.
Wonderful.
That rocked on for 200 years and it had enormous success. Technological breakthroughs, depending where you live in the world, a 5-fold increase in the standard of living, remarkable medical, elimination of disease, etc. But of course, with polarization of wealth,
Quick definition of polarization of wealth.
so the pushing of wealth to the extremes.
Rich getting richer.
The
poor
rich getting
richer.
rich, poor getting poorer, that kind of thing. And we might come back to that later when we talk political theories around Marxism, etc. So we really noticed, and the 60s is a pivotal moment because that's when you get the voices. And we talked about dominant narratives and alternative narratives in history. And that's where second wave feminism, civil rights movement, birth of green politics, anti-war. In other words, there were clear indications that there were people who were challenging because they wanted change to the established way, the established belief systems that underpinned the time. And we jump ahead to where we are now, and with some fairly cataclysmic climate change going on, you can see that we are certainly in that space where the idea of what it means to be good is to go along with governments. Maybe in this liberal capitalist democracy, maybe we go back to John Locke, who says, but if the government isn't doing good, then you have the right to challenge. because we can see the demonstrations in terms of the globe itself and its health and the health of people. There's polarization of wealth, but there's polarization of views in society. So what does it mean to be good in the modern world is a really tricky question, because we're, I think, in that place where I said before about place and space and accepted hegemonic beliefs. Well, we're in a transitioning or a pioneering society. So really, in some ways, Michael, what you're doing is quite important, because I think we're redefining that very word. Because for some people, it's absolutely social activism. We're at a point where the fabric that holds people together, the glue of society, is no longer based on a shared set of scientific facts. Everything's up for dispute in this world of misinformation, the weaponization of misinformation. So for some people, to do good would be that we have to protest, march, challenge, block. You look at Extinction Rebellion. You look at Just Stop Oil. So these are citizens who've said, my definition of good is, well, we can't just go on as business as usual. Because if we do, we're already seeing the effects on the globe that many of the climate scientists thought we'd see in the 30s. It's the early 20s, and they're already here. So for some people, good is, I have to get in the face of liberal capitalist democracy, and I have to wake other people up and challenge it. For others, it's to put a stop to very people like that. You know? So, but this is typical of it when you get this breakdown of accepted hegemonic beliefs.
Interesting. And the shift in that, right? So we're talking to the first shift, or the kind of the original shift from the feudal system to now.
Yep.
What would you say the core trigger within human nature has been to cause that? Societal change? Has it been education through the bourgeoisie as an example? Or?
Yeah, certainly that the big sweep of history, and you look at the causal factors of change, and you can go back to look at what started the march to the end of feudalism. And one of the key things there is the Renaissance. And what that required was an emerging middle class, the bourgeoisie. Good to see you remember your history, Michael. Well done. That's an A for my ex-student. The bourgeoisie, who had the money and the time, but because they weren't hereditary, they weren't regarded as the aristocracy. They were this class that didn't fit. And in many ways, what's going to break the feudal triangle down is the fact that emerging from within it is this group that doesn't fit. And if the feudal pyramid is held down by these beliefs in God, then the first sign of fracture, coupled with this emerging new middle class, which will come to be the dominant class in the modern society, then the writing's on the wall. But how does it begin? As you correctly identified, Michael, it's essentially education. Because the bourgeoisie, the Medicis in Italy, for example, to pick one of the families, they're the ones that indulge the classics. They bring back the Greek. They bring back the arts. They're the family that sponsor Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci. Now, we wouldn't have these works unless you had these families who basically artists in residence. They were patrons. And some of the great works that you regard with the Middle Ages are born because this class emerged that indulged. And that's why it's called the Renaissance, which is French for the rebirth. The rebirth in what? Thinking, education, evaluation. And you can go back even further, because poor old Pope Urban, no relation to Keith, when he called the first crusade, like that? Thanks, mate. You've got to chuck a bit in every now and again.
Yeah, well,
when he called that first crusade in 1096, he didn't think he was undoing Christendom and feudalism. He thought he was defending it. But what we had in those 9 crusades over 200 years was European knights in particular, but also all their foot soldiers, etc., going back and forth to the Middle East. And what happened was this exchange of ideas, this exchange of goods. Of course, the Middle East scientifically, mathematically, engineeringly, was a whole different set of ideas.
Is that the emergence of the Silk Road?
The Silk Road has been around for even longer because that's all the way
The whole
to
way.
China.
Okay, yep.
And that's Marco Polo, but it's a
Yes.
similar era. So Marco Polo is like 1215. I'm talking 1096. So you're in the ballpark, Michael.
Cool.
Again, that's more like a B minus. But
That's more like what I was used to.
so this is what leads to the growth of towns and the emergence of a middle class and the emergence of a bourgeoisie. You see, and Pope Urban, Keith, he didn't even know what he was doing, but he unleashes those forces because when you get growth in cities, a middle class, merchant class emerging, don't have the hereditary power. What am I going to do with my money? I'm going to indulge my kids. I'm going to start universities. I'm going to indulge the arts. And because that starts the Renaissance, which is a rethinking and a rebirth, we get a reformation, a reformation of the Catholic Church, the one universal church. And so you see now the hegemonic beliefs, they're fading already. You've got this class emerging. And they start to challenge with this idea of humanism. And they start to challenge the divine right of kings. And so all of a sudden, the glue is dissolving. And we get this whole age of revolutions that are born out of the Reformation. You get a French Revolution. You get an Industrial Revolution. But what we get is this modernity, with it sometimes, the Enlightenment project or the Enlightenment, because boom, light bulb, science. Reason. This is the way forward. And we build a whole world around that. Jump ahead to where we are now. And I would suggest we're looking at a similar phase in that big sweep of history, where you can see the same sort of trends and threads that people are challenging. New ideas are emerging. The reality is that glue is dissolving because demonstrably life is not so good for lots of people.
Fascinating how we've had the shift from, I guess you could almost say, wealth or capital accumulation has resulted in education, which has resulted in, or wealth distribution at the start. And so now we're at a point where we've got majority wealth, but we've kind of gone, if I were to say, highly polarized to a stronger middle class base, back to a higher level of polarization again, but with higher levels of education already in play. So generations have now been consistently educated, and we have, I guess, particularly within the Western world, more or stronger civil rights or human rights movements across the board. I guess the next question then would be to identify or talk to what that, or can you think of a few of the key progressive points or historic triggers that have helped us get to this point now over the last kind of more recent time with the technology advancements?
Yeah, well, certainly technology is always part and parcel of any progressive leap for humans. And right now, of course, we're in a massive technological leap. But it's not so much that, it's more the emancipation of a lot of humanities whose voice was never heard. So half of humanity is women. You might have met some. Of course, their voice was silenced for so long. For so long. Any woman that you know from history it must be remarkable to overcome the barriers for her voice to be heard. Let's face it, we it's only last century, and it's only 100 years ago, women starving themselves in England, in the suffragette movement, just to be recognised for the right to vote. That not goods and chattels, not a smaller brain not capable of making political decisions. That's only 100 years ago, Michael. And in the sweep of history, that's a minute ago. So we spent a lot of time in human history only listening to a certain percentage of voices. The rich tapestry of humanity is only at its best when we listen to all the voices. It's just right at this point where we're even listening to even more than we used to, the gay community, transgender, etc. It's at a time when the glue's dissolving. So the trouble is, people retreat to fundamentalism. Just like Hobbes, who in the first social contract, when the Civil War was on and they chopped the head off Charlie, he's like, wait a minute, this is completely wrong. And he comes up with this idea that we have to be obedient to an absolute monarch by the divine right of kings. And so that's a retreat, because he was shaken by what was happening. In the same way, and you see it in the hate speech online, some people are very lost. And you can understand why, because they just don't. When someone moves the ground on which you stand, and when fundamental ideas that you've kind of taken as hegemonic are kind of exposed as not, and no one's ever sat and said to you, look, they're actually socially constructed. It can be a very scary thing. And a retreat to fundamentalism is a safety net, but it gets very dangerous, and it gets very judgmental, and it gets very violent when people look for that surety and they find it in a tribe that uses prejudice and hate as the new glue. And it gives that people that sense of belonging that they feel like they've lost, but they're hooking themselves to hate and horror.
So why is it? So can we talk to I guess what I'm trying to say is, what is the connection point between fundamentalism and fascism that works so effectively?
Yes. So a kind of an elitist political philosophy, as we saw in the 1920s and 30s, was born out of a society that was in a state of social and economic decay. We talked before about narratives in history. And I talked before about consensus views. So there are truisms in history that do transcend place and space. People have trouble transcending place and space, but ideas can. One of the lessons of history is very clear, that in a time of economic and social chaos, political extremes will come. It's the natural inevitability of someone who can't feed their kids, someone that can't put a roof over their head, someone that can't make sense of the chaos on the streets. And the lure of the strong man, the lure of the simple black and white, just do this, to acquiesce, Michael, to a greater power that you can just give in, not necessarily give up, but give in. That cognitive overwhelm, you can just hand it to someone else. That exhaustion is lifted from your shoulders. And this is the lure of fascism. Plus, it just plays on those deeper psychological, darker prejudices. Find someone to blame, Michael. The power of the scapegoat. Oh, legendary in history. I know who's responsible. It's not you. You're great. All you got to do is listen to me and I'll fix it. I know who's to blame and I know how to punish them. And I know the pathway. Simple. And the lure of that in times of economic and social chaos is very strong. So people will start to listen to extremist views that they would not listen to if the social and economic conditions under which they live were more stable.
And therefore, we have a sound argument towards stability, countering social justice, to oppose fascism, which is the unfortunate reality of politics. There's always sound logic on both sides.
If you walk into the Holocaust Museum in Washington in the US, there's 14 early warning signs of fascism. Sometimes it's 11 in other documents online. There's 14 in that one. You know, you can tick off a lot of them right now in countries like America, particularly under the Trump presidency. If you see what Viktor Orban is doing in Hungary, if you see what's going on in Poland, and you see it, it's the demonization of migrants. It's the demonization of anything considered deviant in a lifestyle choice, homosexuality. anything like that. There's a whole list of things, and it's all happening again. But history doesn't repeat, which is, I know, and people sing songs about it, and because it's always different. So it's a bit of a misnomer to say the history repeats. Are there patterns and rhyme and rhythm? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Have I seen this before? Yes, you have. But it has its own nuances that do make it different. It's the different people, etc. People want to compare what was happening in the 20s and 30s with what is happening now. And of course, those comparisons are valid, but it's not a repeat. Those fledgling democracies in Italy and Germany and Spain were very vulnerable because constitutions were new. We have a lot more protections today. So it's not like we're watching the re-emergence of fascism and we know where it's going to go. However, history does teach us we need to be very cautious, because the Holocaust doesn't start with death camps. It starts with words. It starts with the demonization of the other. It starts by supporting big lies. So we know, and it starts by the demonization of minorities. It starts with anti-Semitism. It starts with the lack of tolerance for any deviant lifestyle. Now, we can see that happening in Europe. It's happening in America. It's happening on most continents. We're a little bit more buffered here in Australia, but that certainly is entering into our political body politic, and it's disturbing. And that's where our lessons of history come in.
I think it's a good time now to shift towards, I guess, the diving into the political systems that control the different parts of the world. I mean, the two most, well, we've obviously got the capitalist system and the communist system, which are the most well-known, obviously.
Yeah.
Can we get a bit of an idea of pros and cons of each per se? Or can we talk to a little bit around the history of...
Yeah. So maybe we need to go Hegel.
Mm-hmm.
So Hegel's the one who talks about a dialectic, and it fits with that idea of hegemonic beliefs. So Hegel's a really interesting guy. He's not easy to read, but his idea is that there is a thesis, and that's your dominant ideas or your dominant class at the time. And inevitably there is an antithesis, and that'll be the challenge. So it's a new idea or an emerging new power, and a clash is inevitable. Boom. And then you'll have a synthesis, and that synthesis becomes the new thesis, and inevitably an antithesis will rise, etc., etc. Now Hegel says in the end there'll be a spiritual awakening, that the final synthesis is like a liberation of the human soul. It's kind of cosmic and ethereal, and it's very nice. Let's see if he's right. So Marx takes that dialectic, and he calls it dialectic materialism, because his materialism is that all activity is economic, that exploitation is economic classes, those that have against those that haven't. And so he said, so at the end of feudalism, what you had was the landed gentry was the thesis, and the emerging bourgeoisie, the middle class, was the antithesis. Clash, new synthesis. And that synthesis is the bourgeoisie. And then he said, the antithesis will be the proletariat, because the working class who are being exploited by the bourgeoisie will be the ones that will challenge, and that there will be a clash and there will be a synthesis. And his argument would be that the final synthesis would be communism. But it would have to unfold in a certain way. And so what a lot of people would say about communism is that it's been tested in the modern world and it's failed, except none of the variations we've seen are Marxist theory, because it all went wrong. And there is a rumour, Michael, that Karl said even before he died, that one thing I do know is I'm not a Marxist, which is implying that even in his lifetime, his theories were being distorted and taken places that he didn't necessarily agree with.
Interesting.
Because fundamental to the dismissal of the left side of politics is, of course, Stalin. It's, of course, the Bolsheviks. It's Lenin. But see, that's because Lenin rewrote Marxism, Marxist-Leninism. Because Marx said, where will the communist revolutions begin? And it wasn't Russia, and it wasn't China. it was the industrial West, because he said polarization of wealth, which we talked about before, and that's happening globally now, but he was talking more on a national scale back then before capital went global, post-World War II. He said it's inevitable because capitalism sows the seeds of its own destruction because it has to grow. And it grows with the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. And what happens to the poor getting poorer is that's what'll wake them up and make them revolutionary. And unless you have that phase, then they're not going to get revolutionary. Unless you taste the dust of what it means to be the powerless in a society, you're not going to create a political consciousness or a political awareness. So not the peasants of feudal Russia or the peasants of feudal China, but in fact the working class in the cities of England and France and America. That's where he predicted it would happen. Because he said even religion, which he described as the opiate of the people, in other words, not that you'd know, Michael, because you're a good boy, but an opiate is a type of drug and it's a narcotic. And of course, it's famous for sitting on your ass and just letting life wash over you in a nice mellow vibe. So in other words, religion is the opiate of the people because the ruling classes invented it so that the working class would accept unacceptable conditions because their reward is not on this life, it's in the next. Brilliant. But if you have that advanced stage of capitalism, Marx said, but that would wake up even those who've swallowed the opiate. Then the next phase is the revolution, and that's the smashing the state. And this is the criticism of Marx, that it's a violent, ugly, certain people are up against the wall, blood on the streets. Marx's argument is that, of course, those who have the power are not going to give it up easily. So you have to take it from them. Then he would say there's a temporary dictatorship of the proletariat. So you'd need the leaders of the proletariat to temporarily take the lead to purge society of bourgeois values, to teach people how to live. But see, this is where Lenin took that phase and said, well, that's not temporary. And then Stalin said, well, it's not even forget the proletariat. We'll just use the word temporary, lose the word proletariat. Let's just have dictatorship. So we've never seen those next two phases because after that, Marx said the socialist or socialism phase would be from each according to his ability, to each according to his labour, a recognition that to build a society of equals, some people would have to work harder initially before the state withers away. And because everyone owns everything, you don't need a police force for crimes other than physical violence because there's no embezzlement, there's no fraud, there's no theft. And from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. So that family of 5 has a greater need than that family of 2, and that's the basis for the distribution of wealth. Now, we never got there, but it is essentially an optimistic view that people can live in a state. And so he talked about primitive communism back in the day when basically you lived in towns that were small enough that people participated, and made decisions. So it's like that form, but on a bigger scale. So in some ways, it has this essential view that human nature is good. Like it's problematic because there's violence on the way. And that's why people have taken those last phases and written other theories, but based on that definitive work of the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. So one of my favourites, Michael, is, have you ever heard of a Roman general called Quintus Fabius Maximus?
Ooh. I dare say I have.
It's a cool name. This is why I dropped it. But it's also Quintus Fabius Maximus brought down the great enemy Carthage without essentially firing a shot. Because what he did was he lay siege to the great capital. Excuse me. Nothing got in, nothing got out. He wore it down. He wore them down. And the Fabian socialists, born in England, take the name from Quintus Fabius Maximus, and that's their idea. Don't like the idea of smashing the state, like all the other stuff. Think human nature is basically good. Think we can live in a communal-based society where there is equal ownership and equal distribution, but no, we're not going to do it by blood. So the Fabian socialists talk about through the ballot box, one cut at a time. you'll bring about the change through the established democratic systems, and you'll work your way towards a fairer redistribution of wealth and a fairer society. And the welfare state is largely born from that kind of Fabian socialist view. So that's a kind of a positive view of humanity, but whether or not it can be done. And that's the thing. Are we too greedy, Michael?
That was going to be the next question, I guess. The fundamentals of human nature.
Yeah.
If you were to ask most people walking down the street, what are the 5 key examples of what makes up a human being? I'd say a lot of people would put greed in there.
Yeah. Or is the best of humanity only on display when the structures under which they live encourage the best? And do we see the worst of humanity when the structures pander to the lowest common denominator, that feed your envies, your prejudices, that wealth is so unevenly distributed that you are criminalized in your behavior in just an attempt to put food on your table when others can live a jet-set life? Do the structures under which we live create the good that is inherent in humanity? Or is human nature fundamentally flawed because it's too self-interested and too individual, and therefore self-fulfillment, greed, whatever, will win the day? And that, of course, is the realm of philosophy more than history, but we can look at how those different political philosophies and theories, basically they'll have to make a decision about the nature of humans in their theories. Do we invest in the entrepreneurial class, Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, trickle-down effect, invisible hand, market forces, etc.? Or do we invest in the least advantaged? Because the common good is best served when we don't have an underclass. Is crime created by those because they are just simply do not participate in capitalism, because they're actively disenfranchised by it? Is that addict someone who deserves our scorn or our help? Is that guy who's using a knife to hold up the local garage, do we give him scorn or do we give him help? And if we, in fact, like John Rawls says, invest in the lowest, then the solidarity for all of us is the common good. And so political philosophies, fundamental decisions about how you see human nature, individuals have to really think about this stuff.
And this is, it's funny because you use the word we to say, do we consider? And, you know, we as a individual, we as a community, we as a nation, we as a civilization.
Yes.
And so where do we draw the line? Where do we draw the line as to how big is too big to consider? And this is where, which we will talk to, the problem with the polarization of wealth comes in. If someone's struggling to feed their family, they can't consider these bigger issues, these bigger things.
Correct.
And that's part of the issue. But we have also digressed slightly because
Yes.
before we go
Well, we've gone everywhere.
further, yeah, well,
Sometimes I'm not even sure where I've gone myself.
that's I do want to dive back to capitalism as well and talk
Yeah.
a little bit. So we've got a good basis of communism
Yeah.
there and the history there. So that's
Yes.
fantastic. Thank you. Can we talk to capitalism as well before we proceed any further? Because I'd like to have a little bit more of a description of the connections between capitalism, consumerism, and, well, less capitalism, consumerism, sorry. Let's say capitalism and democracy and the evolution of that, and what the benefits of the free market are. And obviously we know where we've led to here in the Western world.
Because you ask the average punter in the street, and of course, capitalism, they'll know the term, they'll understand it, they know they live in it, and they know that it's based around market forces. But of course, there are those who advocate for small government, less intervention, let the market forces do their thing. Now, we saw in the early Industrial Revolution with laissez-faire capitalism what tends to happen. And of course, that was not good because you had exploitation of the working class to a degree that led to, phenomenal suffering. It was the slums of Victorian England, the overcrowding, the working 6 days a week for a couple of penny, the new machines that could rip an arm off, and that's just bad luck because there is no workers' compensation. There is no union. So we know that when you let the forces in their purity run, then you get something like laissez-faire, and that doesn't go so well. So with the birth of trade unions and politicians born from that class, we start to get more government intervention. And this is where the blueprint for the modern liberal capitalist democracy comes from. Building on that whole social contract thing, fueled by an economic system based on human desire to accumulate wealth, human desire to improve oneself. So this strong sense of individualism, this belief that striving under the banner of the market forces, the price mechanism, governments intervening just where they have to, but not a lot, setting a few regulations, maybe a minimum wage here, etc., will bring about the perfectible society because it's based on individuals striving to be self-actualized, accumulation of wealth, etc. So the trouble would be this 20th century, the one just gone, should have probably been the pinnacle of the whole human project. And we lost 160 million people just in 2 world wars. And we saw terrible events on every continent. What are the lessons of that? What went wrong? And that's why I said in some ways before, we're at the point where people are questioning those key ideas that underpin the liberal, capitalist, Western democracies. Because there was this guy, Michael, called Francis Fukuyama, who took that dialectic idea we had before, and he came up with a thesis called, a theory called the end of history. So he declared in the early 90s it was the end of history. Not the end of anything happening, but the end of the dialectic. In other words, that the liberal capitalist democracy was the thesis. It was challenged by communism in the Cold War, and the clash just meant that the West won. The left was disgraced. Its ideas were found to be unsubstantive, and so there was no real challenge. And so that's the end of history, the final synthesis. And he predicted that China would become increasingly democratized, that Russia would, etc. Now, none of that happened. And 25 years later, he wrote his final piece where he said, I was wrong, because I didn't see that liberal capitalist democracies could retreat, that they could retract. I thought they'd just grow. And so you had other theorists like Kincheloe Maclaren who were saying, yeah, that's because your theory was fundamentally flawed, because many people live in a collective state of social amnesia induced by media-driven hyperreality, which I know is a mouthful. But in other words, we pretend and we purposefully almost forget, because life is comfortable enough if you're in the middle class liberal Western capitalist democracies. You kind of know that every minute or so there's a child somewhere dying of malnutrition and preventable disease. And you kind of know that the lifestyle you live is fairly dependent on the exploitation of workers in the third world. But I've got this 75-inch LED TV. I've got this new car with all the bells and whistles. I can drink Yamundi beer. So the seductive nature of capitalism, consumerism. Are we living in a collective state of social amnesia induced by this hyperreality that's driven by the media?
What year was that initial quote made?
Yeah, so Kinslow McLaren wrote in response to Francis Fukuyama because he was making fantastic money. It's a great idea. End of history. Catchy, isn't it? Everyone's go, oh, what's his theory? So he toured the world, made a fortune. And of course, there were theorists that go, no, it's not. The dialectic hasn't ended. In fact, it's very real, and it's just that we're not seeing it. And I think you and I in the 2023s are now looking at really hard evidence of particularly environmental ecosystem collapse that you really can't ignore anymore. In the 90s, we could. Kyoto Protocol, we're doing something, we'll tinker around the edges for a little bit. The theory was, in the second half of the 21st century, you might have to get serious, but it got serious really quick. I don't know if I answered your question. I think I was going somewhere else. I wanted to start with that. What did you ask me? I think I wandered off. Sorry, Michael.
We're on a journey here, mate.
Right. Fair enough.
Don't you worry about it. What I would like to focus on, I guess, next is because you've brought up that quote. We live in a social amnesia induced by a media-driven hyperreality is probably one of the more important lessons that I learned through school, through your teachings.
Yep.
And it's a perspective when you look at your phone and you scroll through Instagram, or you hop in your nice comfy bed at night. That is very important, I think, for people to contemplate.
Yeah.
And not just sit comfortably with.
No.
And I wonder what, I guess, looking at this hyperreality we're living in now, because when, they called it a hyperreality then, God, what would they call it now?
Yes. So
let's talk to technology, the evolution of society within a technologically advanced world, and how these political systems can work when the world is getting smaller digitally.
Yes.
Larger and more separately from a economic and political standpoint. How do we, well, not necessarily how. Can you talk to that for a little bit?
Sure. Look, it's terribly exciting and terrifying, but that's often humanity and its relationship with technology. If we go back to the Luddites, let's go back to the Industrial Revolution, and of course machines, like the giant looms and the great turning wheels of the industrial dark mills, were replacing humans. And there were people that didn't like what was happening. And the Luddites would smash the machines. They'd break into the factories and they'd smash it up because they feared what machinery was doing to humanity. Now, I'm sure there's some Luddites around today looking at AI and feeling the same thing. And just like back then, when those who saw the opportunity and embraced it, and there were magnificent breakthroughs that affected so many people in so many positive ways. But of course, some people became unemployed. Some people lost their lives because they got chewed up by these things. We're almost at the same point again now, because is this the fourth industrial revolution that we're facing? Except not industrial anymore because it's AI based. The potential for elimination of disease is here in a way we've never seen before. The potential for genetically modified plants, the application of AI in every field, medicine, engineering, mathematics, space exploration. It's phenomenal. But history often teaches us as well, though, that when technology moves faster than the ethics that underpins it, then we can have trouble. And I'll just speak to a personal example. I was watching, there were like these 4 very human-like robots, fascinatingly human. And that's what most people were looking at this display. I think it was Tokyo. And they were answering the journalists' questions, and their makers and programmers were sitting there next to them. And of course, everyone's like, wow, fantastic. And they were eerily human. But for me, one of the things was, and it reminded me of the Luddites, and it reminded me of ethics falling behind technology. And I don't know why more journalists didn't cover it, but one smart journalist turned to one of the programmers / maker and said, what did you think about what you just saw? And one of these guys said, oh, well, some of the answers surprised me. And I thought, oh, hello. For me, that was like a light bulb moment. You have those light bulb moments in life. There's one for me. I'm like, wow. So in other words, when you exceed the sum of your parts, when the manufacturer, the programmer, the maker is genuinely surprised by an answer that was given to a question, then how far away is sentience? You know, like where it's touchable. And then you got to think about, well, what lessons are we teaching AI? That's my fear. You know, because we've all seen the sci-fis. You know, there's Terminator and all this sort of stuff, and robots versus humans because robots are. But there's also those sci-fi movies that explore the concept of, what if AI becomes sentient and looks at the world and says, what's the best way to protect the planet? Is there one species that's so invasive that it's actually damaging the fundamentals of life, the building blocks of the chemical building block, that it's damaging so many other species that it's driving them to extinction? Well, then the conclusion would be that it's us. So what are we teaching AI? What if AI realizes, no, actually the way to save the planet is to get rid of the most dangerous species?
It's a very real concern. The evolution of AI and the ethics of AI is something that I will be actually releasing in a little early announcement. But we'll be doing.
You heard it here first,
yeah,
folks.
we'll be doing a fair bit of that, a couple of segments on that actually, because it is such an important topic to talk to.
Yeah.
What's teaching AI and what I think it's where the concern comes in with sentience, as you say, is at what point when it starts taking its own perspective of the objective nature of what human beings create, but whether it looks at the planet and identifies with the planet, or looks at humans and identifies with humans, or looks to create itself in biological format is also a very real possibility too. With if we're talking about genotechnology and AI in the same sentence.
That's right.
So it's through this we talk about these levels of innovation, space exploration, etc. Who's to say that we won't be able to find new sustainable political systems that help support us through these trialing times?
Yes,
perhaps too.
Sometimes great cataclysm brings about rebirth. There's no doubt about it.
Absolutely.
And that might be what's coming, because we've got a few potential cataclysms. But history also teaches us that if there's times in history where you probably would have thought the world was coming to an end, and it didn't. We're still here. That's also a lesson of history. But the use of the word polycrisis, we're in a polycrisis. In other words, has humanity seen this many threads of disaster?
It's a compounding effect, isn't it?
Yeah.
You look at the nuclear impact.
Yeah.
Back in the Cold War, for instance, and that's a devastating fear. But that's still there.
Yeah. Yes.
That hasn't gone away now.
No, particularly on the Russian-Ukraine front.
Yeah.
That's
And then you add the artificial intelligence, which is still there's debates and arguments either side. But look, we have a winding up policy on this.
Yes.
On this podcast.
Yes.
Mr. Baker.
Yes.
Paul?
Yes, Michael. My ex-student has come back to haunt me.
What is good to you?
Yes. Oh, look, I think people have to have fundamental principles to live by, sometimes an axiom or two that sort of summarizes it. So for me, there's I have to be able to look at myself in the mirror and like what I see. And I can do that and I think there's two quotes I'll chuck out here at you, Michael, to finish off. Voltaire's, I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend with my life your right to say it. It's one of the most fundamental defences of democracy you can have. And I think if people were prepared to really defend people's right to express their opinion, as long as it's not hate speech, vilification, then dialogue might be more possible and we might be able to find the common good. So I don't know if I defend with my life your right to say it, but I certainly think that is something that I try to live by. That's why I always try to listen to everyone. I think the other one, the big one for me, is there but for the grace of God go I. So you don't have to be religious. You can be an agnostic, Michael. In other words, there, who? That junkie, that homeless person, that single domestic violence beaten mother. There, if but for another set of circumstances, goes I. I happen to be gifted with the parents I had and the upbringing I had, but there, but for that, but for the grace of God, go I. So if you can see the other, you see yourself in the other. When you look at the other, you see you. That's just you under a different set of circumstances. If you're born in a different place, a different space, what if it was you that was raised in that family where you had dysfunctional parents because there was substance abuse or domestic violence? What if that was you because you were just happened to be born in a place where some despot uses his army to take over the area and you've just got to flee with what's on your back? There, but for the grace of God, go I. And if we could all see ourselves in the other, then the common good, Michael, would be assured.
If you could change one thing in the world, what would that be?
Whoa, that's a big one. Only one thing. One thing. If I could change one thing. Wow. See, there's a lot I would like to change. So I'm trying to look at something causal that could lead then to further change. So it's got to be something around the rules of rational debate. It's got to be something around, we've got to reclaim our basis of reality on an agreed set of scientific fact. We can't be living in this world of alternative facts anymore because that's the weaponization of disinformation. Because we no longer have a common set. Now, I don't know how I can change that, but if anything, I'd change that there was an agreed to set of scientific and historical facts from which we can debate. Because if we can't find that common ground, then you're never going to turn that Trump supporter into a logical human. Well, not every Trump supporter, but certainly the QAnon cult type. You know what I mean? Like, because you can't rationally have a debate with someone that doesn't accept basic scientific fact, basic historical fact. If that's up for grabs, then it doesn't matter. Democracy will fail. Liberalism will fail because you'll never find the common ground. The common good will never, because what you will get is fascism because there'll be this one view that has to dominate, and if you don't have it, then you forfeit your right to exist. Now, we've seen that before. But the belief in the fundamental goodness of humans, coupled with a rational basis on which we can discuss our differences, that might be the thing. I don't quite know how I'm going to do that, but
I'll vote for you.
Getting too old, mate. Getting too old.
Paul, it has been an absolute pleasure, mate. It's truly it is such a, to commit 35 years of your life and to educate passionately as you have. And it's the fact that you've been recognised and rewarded and acknowledged throughout your career is of no surprise. And it is important that it is happening because the work that you do is incredible. The way that you inspire is incredible. The general approach that you have to problems and issues is fantastic, and again, as I've mentioned before, has made a very strong impact on my life, and for that I thank you. So thank you again for joining us here today on Chasing Good, and mate, all the best.
Let's keep chasing.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for listening to Chasing Good, a Circle Group podcast. Our mission is to shift the world closer to kindness, sustainability, awareness, and action. We hope you enjoyed. Until next time.